With your host, Andrew Donaldson. This is Heard Tell.
Welcome to Heard Tell Show. This is twice on Sunday. This is our recap of the week that was at Heard Tell, where we try to turn down the noise of the news cycle, get the good information, have great conversations with knowledgeable guests, kind of ignore all that caterwauling that we find all over the news cycle, and get to things that actually matter so we can discern the times we live in. We do this primarily through talking, conversations, discussing with knowledgeable guests, trying to keep wider perspectives, find out things we don't know, challenge our own thinking sometimes, and see if we can't make the world a little bit better place, one discourse at a time. We don't want to just add to all the yelling and hollering and fussing on the interwebs and social media and places like that. We had 5 great guests on this week on Heard Tell. The first one was Grace Bydalek. And despite the fact that I mispronounced her name 6 ways to Sunday, she was very gracious, suffered through for us. Great conversation. She started out, she wrote a piece about COVID policy with some certain governors, what's called Calvinball. If you don't know Calvinball, she'll explain that from the Calvin and Hobbes comic, and it's become its own meme online. But the second part of this conversation got very personal and in-depth, and I just loved it so much. We talked about culture, like the performing arts, like theater, music, things like this that we've somehow got pushed to the side during the pandemic and lockdowns and things like that, and how important they are to us as human beings. She's also a working actress and performer, so she has great insights on that. She also talked about what it was like to be in New York City, those early days of the lockdowns when things got very, very dark in a very, very big hurry. Grace Bydalek, part of that conversation on Heard Tell right now. So something obviously got you into the arts, got you into acting. Talk about the human side of it. Like, why is that important? Because you talked about, you work with kids. You were in New York City for the worst of this stuff. You saw it firsthand. Yeah. Talk about what the arts means to people, not just as a performer, but, if you're a performer, you started as a fan first. That's just how that works. Talk about the human side of it. And when that's taken away, we really do miss a part of us that's human. That is, it's not as important as your food and things like this, but it really is important to your psyche. And it is important to us as a people, isn't it?
Yes, 100%. The human side is incredibly important. I always go back to the Dead Poet Society quote, where Robin Williams' character says, the human race is filled with passion, medicine, law, business, engineering. These are all noble pursuits and necessary to sustain life. But poetry, beauty, romance, and love, these are what we stay alive for. I think we saw a lot of that in the pandemic, where people were recognizing, oh, I haven't seen live music in 2 years, or, oh, I haven't touched somebody in weeks or months or years. People, even in New York City now, we're seeing people just standing in crowded concert halls and crying because they're able to experience these things again, because they're able to experience each other again, because they're able to see each other's faces again. And so I think COVID was it just emphasized how important human connection and artistry really is.
Do you think we've learned any human lessons out of COVID? We've been talking a lot about, we've learned a lot about how our government functions or doesn't function, to be more specific. We've learned a lot about how science works and doesn't work. We've learned that the academic and science community needs to work on their communication to the common people by their own admission, and to their credit, they realize, like, hey, we're not real good at this TV thing. We need to work on this. Those are all well and good. Have we learned any human lessons, do you think, from this COVID thing? Because you're a performer, you're on the human side of the scale of those things. Are we learning anything as human beings about connecting and talking to people and just appreciating life? That the famous dead, since you want to go Dead Poet Society, the carpe diem part of the life, are we seizing the day, or are we just kind of reverting to our priors and going, well, this just confirms everything I thought before?
I can't speak to the general human experience, but I can speak to my own. I know that COVID for me stripped my life of so many unnecessary distractions. and so many unnecessary pursuits, and all sorts of unnecessary striving, and brought me back to what was fundamentally most important in my life, which was family, which was connections with my friends and ensuring that my friends were okay, which was my relationship to God, and my ability to reflect, and process. And so I think we're seeing a lot of people kind of get back to basics in a way that is beautiful, and I think will prove very fruitful, specifically in the artistic sphere. Like, I can't wait to see what people have been creating, and I think we've only just kind of seen the tip of the iceberg as far as that goes.
Yeah, Grace Bydalek, staying with us on Heard Tell. Great conversation. Let's take that one step forward. We go forward. I know on our program we talk about, we do culture and politics. I don't think those are separable. I think they go together, and I don't mean in the culture warring way that people have just kind of made a business model out of it. You know, politics is how people govern themselves, and culture is what those people are. I just don't think you can separate those two things. When you look at it from the culture side, like you just talked about, it stripping away the nonsense. Let me just ask you, why do you do it? Because, you know, you have your career, you're a working actor, you're kind of living your dream. Why get in the dirty pool end of it with doing the politics stuff?
I think that's a great question, and I would ask that to you as well. My answer is politics affects policy, which affects people. And so I've seen in real time the ramifications of political decisions made by our elite class on people like you and me, and like my brother, and like my family, and like the kids that I'm involved with in the Bronx. And I think if we care about each other, we should care about politics as well.
Yeah, for me, that's exactly what it is, you know, it's a people thing. And
Yeah.
I keep watching the news, and they never talk about issues as people, and they don't talk about politics as people, and they talk about demographics without somehow realizing that those demographics are all people. And I just got tremendously frustrated, especially when, you know, I went through my health stuff where I couldn't work a quote unquote real job anymore. And, you know, now I do this for 15 hours a day. But I just got tremendously frustrated of like, no, this is not how you talk about people. You know, the news networks, and I don't want to bash media because we have lots of good friends in journalism. The good journalists, they're always, you know, it's something somebody told me about writing years ago when I first started writing. And I remember it's like, whatever you're writing about people. Whatever business you're in the people business. You know, it's about people. And so much of our media and culture and politic discourse was completely devoid of people. It was all buzzwords, and it's all just issues. And I want this policy, and my team needs to win. And it's all power structures. And it's like, that's why you guys, nobody can talk to anybody anymore, is because everybody's just talking about these things as if they're in the abstract, and you're not dealing with people anymore.
Right. I totally agree. And this kind of polarization that we see is really unfortunate. You know, I was in a musical theater program in college that was entirely liberal, except for me. And we would have, I was able to have open conversations with people, and sit down with people over breakfast and talk about policy, or sit down with people who didn't necessarily understand a conservative perspective, and speak openly about why I believed the things that I believed, because I believed that they thought the best of me, right? They were assuming my best intentions. And I think that is to a large extent what we've lost. We've lost the ability to sit down at a table over a meal with a person who we vehemently disagree on as far as policy goes, and say to them, you know, I think you're wrong, but I genuinely think that you want the best for the most people. You want the best thing for the most people. And so I'm going to hear you out. And, you know, as I have been in theater and in the arts, I have seen it progress to this place where we are now, which is this kind of cultural illiberalism, where if you don't fall in line with this kind of new orthodoxy, you are not allowed to be a part of the industry. And so it makes me very sad, because I actually think that it is detrimental to the caliber of art that we can make. It's detrimental to the quality of our friendships that we can have. It's detrimental to the interactions with people that we have on a daily basis. And it's also detrimental to our mental health when we're categorizing people in such strict ways. And so it makes me really sad.
Welcome back to Heard Tell Twice on Sunday, as we continue to recap the week that was. One of our favorites. Man, I greatly respect, I treasure his opinion on things, even when we disagree on things. He's a good and honorable man, and I love his perspective on things. Dennis Sanders, our buddy from up in the Twin Cities. He's a writer. He's a pastor. He also works in some media creation stuff. He always has great insights. Been on the program frequently. A while back, we talked a little bit about union labor and some regulation stuff. He wanted to push back on some of that. So, of course, reached out. Of course, you can come on, Dennis. We love having you. Talk union labor. He comes from the perspective, both of his parents were United Auto Workers in Flint, Michigan. As he says and jokes, they were union members, but not of the same union shop, interestingly enough. Dennis talks union labor and what it has been in the past, what it is right now, and pretty clear-eyed about what its future can and should be, and how that doesn't match up with what some of the unions seem to think it should be. We also get into things like regulation. Also, Dennis has a wonderful multi-part series that he's writing about the fall of Sears and Kmart. Younger folks may not realize that for 100 years, Sears was what Amazon is now. That was the place to get just about everything. What happened? Well, it was just capitalism and bad management, right? Not exactly. There's a lot more to that story, and it has a lot of implications for how we do economics, how workers are treated, how companies are run, things like this. So one of our favorites, Dennis Sanders, was on the program on last Tuesday, and we get a little bit of that conversation right now. One thing about unions that always strikes me, I think they're really misbegotten in where they're picking their battles right now. Organized labor, especially big labor, they are all in on going against the gig economy, the secondary economy, whatever you want to call it. Why do you want to alienate? Look, unions are down to something like 10% of the workforce. The gig economy is up to something like 30% of the workforce. Why are you picking a fight with the very people that you're arguing that you want to come into your unions? And all you're really doing is alienate them, because they're like, look, leave us alone and let us work. This seems really misbegotten to me.
That I totally agree with. I think one of the worst things that I've seen, especially the law that came out in California, which I think wreaked havoc on a lot of gig workers. You know, I think part of it comes from this belief that they think that the gig economy is just exploitative. And so they think that, well, wouldn't you really want to just work in an office or in an industry or whatever, like everyone else? What I think the unions don't realize is that the nature of work has changed. There are a lot of people that want to work on their own. They want to be contractors. They want the flexibility that comes with all of that. And so coming in with a law that basically messes all of this up isn't helpful, and it really just makes more enemies against unions than what is necessary. I mean, if unions want to be of help in this changed economy, then what they should be about is trying to create guilds or things to that extent that would help people who do go into the gig economy, instead of trying to basically mess up what they want to do, which is to work independently and to call their own hours. Yeah,
here's where I depart from some of our labor-friendly brethren. I think you absolutely have a right to start a union. I've been a supervisor in a company that was non-union. We had it hanging on the walls. I've facilitated the meetings for union reps to come into the non-union rep. We set them up in a break room. There's very specific rules how you have to handle those things. I've done all that. I've interacted with them. I know how those things work. My thing is, you absolutely have a right to have a union, but that also means you should absolutely have a right to not have to go through a union to make your livelihood. And that just seems to be the disconnect with some of the big labor folks and people that I know that are genuinely pro-worker, and they really believe that that's the best thing to do. If you're just changing one tyranny of a company to the tyranny of a union, and especially if you have a union that also has the backing of the federal government, which all too often is the case nowadays, there's no way you can convince me that that's pro-worker, because if the union has the backing of the government and you don't have a choice to be in the union or not, where's a worker go then?
Yeah, and I agree. One of the things I remember growing up that I can just remember, even as a kid, I didn't like this, is the whole concept of I think they would call it a closed shop, where basically if you took a job, you are automatically part of the union. And there was a part of me that was bothered by that, because you didn't have a choice of whether you wanted to be in the union or not. And I get what they're trying to get at with collective bargaining and all of that, but you've taken that person's choice of what they want to do out of their hands and just made them and just forced them to do something that they don't want to do. And I think, that's kind of related to what's going on with the gig workers, is this belief that unions are good, so everyone can benefit, and realizing that there is also choice in this. People don't have to join a union. Unions are voluntary organizations, and even in spite of all the good I think that they do, and they do a lot that is good, they're voluntary, and people shouldn't be forced to be part of one if they don't want to be part of one. And I think that's okay. To me, that's part of what it is to be an American. It's a sense of choice of what we want to do.
It's part of what's killing the unions too, that the union was always supposed to be the voice of the worker. Well, everybody's got a voice now because they all have social media accounts. Like, they can Google what their company's doing. They don't need their union rep to explain stock options to them. They all has technology just kind of made part of what the traditional union was obsolete.
They've made part of it. I don't think they've made all of it. And I think this is maybe where the initial pushback came when I wrote to you a while back, is the belief that because we have a more atomized society, social media, things that allow us to speak up, we tend to think that we have more power than we used to. And I think that there in some cases that's true, but in other cases it's not. You may not have the power to say, I would like to have better benefits or to deal with better healthcare. So there are some areas in some industries, not every industry, your one voice doesn't always carry when you're up against a management. And so that's where you would see a need for a union to kind of be that voice. Where I think the caveat is you have to want to have them be your voice. They can't just come in and be your voice. That I think is wrong, because that turns people off. People don't want to have something being done for them. And in some cases, they don't want necessarily a one size fits all thing. So unions are still necessary, but in this day and age, in the age of social media, in the age of a gig worker, it's not going to operate like it did in 1968. We're not that economy. And that's, I think, part of the problem of why unions aren't doing as well is because they haven't necessarily always changed with the times.
Well, Welcome back to Heard Tell. Going back overseas, UK, we love having our UK contributors, and we're working to try to get contributors to other parts of the world as well. We live in a great big world. We don't want to ever just funnel information and pretend like we're just in our own little corner of it. One of our great Young Voices contributors, Alys Watson-Brown, super sharp, great insight. Really enjoyed having her on. Good feedback to this interview and conversation we had with her, talking about the UK response to Ukraine and the Russian invasion there. Also talked a little bit about leadership. Boris Johnson had been mired in scandal, was having all kinds of problems before this crisis come. We'll check in with how he's reacting to things. President Zelensky of Ukraine spoke to UK's parliament, how that landed. Also asked her about the perception of the United States' leadership or lack thereof during this crisis, and her thoughts on that are something you definitely want to hear. Also, towards the end, we talked about the changing liberal world order and how things are changing based off the events in Ukraine. Alys Watson-Brown, fantastic conversation. Got a lot of play on social media. People really responded to this one, and you can listen to part of that conversation right now. Though, there's been this sort of thing of, okay, maybe the UK is trying to find their place in the world because, obviously the British Empire is no more. We're past the Cold War stuff. And then you have the Brexit stuff that just drug on for years after years after years. Is it the feeling now of like, okay, we're not sure what's next with our relationship with Europe, but this aggression from Putin, this obvious, clear and present danger to the Western world order, does this seem like it's clarified it of, okay, we need to put the Brexit stuff behind us. We have to figure out what our relationship with wider Europe is, and we need to move forward. And this is what it's going to look like. It's probably not completely a thought, but it seems like maybe it's been clarified a little bit the last few weeks.
Yeah, people are tired of Brexit being in the media. They're tired of it. People still poll, and supposedly the latest poll is that 49% of British people still think it was wrong to leave. I don't know how much I trust those polls. They don't release the questions that they ask the public. But I think with our relationship with the European Union, in the context of Ukraine, the UK probably would have acted in the interests of NATO rather than the EU as a foreign policy body anyway. And we were able to introduce our sanctions, but we just avoided and surpassed the intergovernmental processes of the EU, which are incredibly complicated. And I think despite our spats with migrants and economic migrants, mainly with Macron, we have to show unity. We can't be petty and talk about technocratic clauses of Brexit and where people can fish. That's not what politicians are there for. This is what these institutions and these alliances were made for, is to stand up to threat and balance power. Because Putin sees this as a zero-sum game. And if we retreat because we are fractured over a political decision that occurred in 2016, how weak are we? There will be no moral backbone if that's what our politicians do. And I think it would be an even graver disappointment if that is what prevented us from taking coherent action. So I think hopefully the Brexit debate is over. When it comes to the bitterness, the soul bitterness that encompassed people and the division, the hatred. It was my first kind of years of becoming politically mature, I guess. First Brexit and then COVID, and each of them was, I'm for and against this. And if you don't agree with me, you are X and you are Y, and you don't have any heart or any soul. And it's strange. I don't know if this happened with America and Trump, you voting Republican in 2016, but the hatred that ensued against people who had voted leave was unprecedented. And I was, young, and I would have voted leave if I was able to vote. I was only 16 at the time. But I couldn't, I felt scared to talk to my friends about it. But now we can talk about it loosely because we know we have way bigger problems in the world, and that's Ukraine. So hopefully it'll just ease the kind of social tensions. Yeah,
talking to Alys Watson-Brown. You raise a good point. So let me just kind of wrap this up in that way then. You talk about generational thing. your generation's too young to remember the Cold War, although it shaped a lot of the world that you grew up in. Things like Brexit, things like this Russian invasion now, these are probably going to be generational defining things for your generation's politics going forward in the UK and probably Europe's as well. We've already seen in Poland and countries like, they got the border right there. They're dealing with this stuff. How do you think that plays out as they look forward? Because we were kind of all assuming that the COVID stuff might be a generation shaping thing, but this may actually kind of eclipse some of that. How do you see that going forward and how it's going to play with that rising generation of, post college starting to become professionals and how they see the world?
Well, there is a sort of running joke among my generation that we're really bored of living through paramount historical events. We've had huge constitutional change, a global pandemic, and possibly on the brink of World War III. To me, what is interesting is how the global liberal order changes and how it will develop. And I possibly see our generation as being the generation that marks the development of a multiplex world, wherein it's not necessarily defined by hegemony or your balance of power, but a multitude of globalized systems, be it trade, finance, non-government organizations, multinational companies, all forming different alliances for different purposes rather than just the United Nations or the ICC or, and I think that is a good thing, but also terrifying, because when it comes to multinational corporations like Amazon or big tech, none of that is democratically accountable. So that means it's all self-reliance. It's all self-protection. It's all finding about how you can keep as much control over your own life as possible, because our lives are so commodified. We're all online now. Every part of us is sellable and usable for a profit to an advertising company. And I think rather than looking at it as what are we, the generation of data, or are we the generation of war and pandemics? I'm leaning towards the former. Mm-hmm. But that's my opinion.
Great answer to an impossible question to answer. So good job on that. Alys Watson-Brown, one last thing to kind of round this back to where we started, the viewpoint of the UK and of Europe a little more broadly. What's the viewpoint over there of America's leadership? We talk, we're obsessed with ourselves. Let's just call it what it is, because we think the whole world revolves around us. But what does Europe and the UK specifically, how do they see America in this crisis? Do they see us as followers? Do they see us as leaders? Do they see us indifferent? How is the current American leadership playing during this crisis in Ukraine?
Well, firstly, I don't think there's anything wrong with American exceptionalism. It's a very interesting phenomenon that is, it's a very specific form of patriotism, which I'm interested in. But my answer to that question, it really depends if you think that Trump would have been better in this situation or Biden. Personally, I think Donald Trump would have been slightly better because he could have mobilized some of the more controversial allies that Biden wouldn't want to go near with a 10-foot barge pole, like Saudi Arabia, for example. There are reports that Saudi aren't even answering Biden's calls. I had that on the radio. I think from our perspective, we need a leader. And this is America's perfect chance to exercise itself as not only a hard power when it comes to sanctions or even, emphasizing the mutually assured destruction concept that was so key in the Cold War, but also as a normative power, a power of promotion of democracy and freedom. But a lot of us now don't necessarily look to America as this beacon of freedom and hope. I think exposed by the sheer impact that COVID had, not at a political level, but at the health level of the US people. People are very sick in Western countries. And I think the US is a kind of powder keg of that, be it from processed food or from bad governments, healthcare inequalities. We're not necessarily looking there domestically, but we would feel incredibly insecure without America with us on the world stage.
Yeah, we do too. Welcome back to Heard Tell Show. Twice on Sunday, continuing to review the week that was. While the news stories are dominated with things like Ukraine and like politics, folks still have to buy stuff, and they're still noticing gas prices and inflation, and it's getting expensive out there. So we do what we do frequently on this program. We had our friend Jericho Hill back. He's an economist, works for one of those four letters, kind of the running joke. He works for one of those 4-letter government agencies, but his opinions are his and his alone. For this matter, but he's our economist buddy. He comes on, explains these things so well that even I can understand them. Gas prices, inflation, how these things actually work. Also, how the war in Ukraine and Russian aggression and the sanctions against Russia are going to greatly affect the world economy in multiple ways. Also talk about how things, like we talked about with other guests, the dirty Russian oligarch money, how the unseen parts of the economy greatly affect the seen parts of the economy. So how things like the UK cracking down and the sanctions are going to affect the wider world economy. Great insight from Jericho Hill. As always, he always throws in a few little wrestling references as well. For those in the know, they can catch on all those little nuggets. Jericho Hill on Heard Tell. Here's a snippet of it right now. We were just talking about the dirty money, the oligarch money. Talk about, because you're an economist, but you're also a sports fan, you keep up with the culture. Explain to folks the ultra wealthy, things like a sports team, like a Chelsea, things like a yacht. Those aren't just token toys. Those are also ways of parking money when you basically have no way to park massive amounts of money any other way to do it. And you got to put it somewhere, right?
Yeah, I mean, art is another great example of a way to park money. But certainly, so of course, some of the folks that invest in sports teams do a very good job of increasing that investment and treating it like a business. And others, it is simply, just as you said, a money dump. There's I think this might be less of an issue for most American sports leagues, but certainly soccer throughout the world is a sort of well-known dumping ground for some of this. Real estate is another dumping ground. Lots of there's also lots of obfuscated real estate holdings. So at the very high end, it doesn't affect the average person when trying to buy a house. People don't buy homes that are hundreds of millions of dollars, right? Unless you're filthy rich. But who exactly holds those very high end real estate homes? Is another thing where you may not necessarily know who actually owns that house, but it's there to park money. It's a diversification strategy. Wu-Tang.
Wu-Tang Financial. Talking to Jericho Hill, master of many things, but mostly economic things. Okay, when we have an uncertainty like the Ukraine situation, this looks like it's going to be at least a semi-protracted war, at least through the summer, probably at the very least. How does the markets start to adjust? Because they can't just keep bouncing out of fear and uncertainty. They're going to settle on something, especially if this starts looking like it's going to go for a while. Because remember, before this, we thought we pretty much had this summer economically figured out. The Fed's going to raise interest rates 3 or 4 times. We're going to have an election year, so they're going to jimmy the money. We're going to have another stimulus package so they can run on that.
We were going to get inflation under control. Yeah, everything looked great.
We thought we had this year under control. Look, at some point though, the powers that be are going to make a decision on what path to take. How do you think that shakes out here in the near term, probably over the next 2-3 months?
I think I first have to say there's a lot of personal bias here about that path because I apparently have more than a quarter of Ukrainian blood in me. So I have a little bit of a loyalty, sympathy here. I don't see this conflict ending nicely. I don't see it ending a whole lot anytime soon. It's going to cost Russia quite a bit. Their economy is already, quite hurting. You can watch the ruble essentially do a roller coaster free fall. And you can watch videos now of folks fighting for stuff in grocery stores, which is reminiscent of another time when Russia used to be called the Soviet Union. Now, how it all, I wish I could say how it would all shake out. I don't know what the military situation is going to look like. I certainly have, hopes that some Ukrainian solution is found to the benefit of the Ukrainian people. I feel badly for them, and have been doing what I can to support the Ukrainian Red Cross and other such organizations that desperately need help. But think about Europe now, and this like in the short run. Let's be a little more optimistic. In the short run, Europe is going to suffer from pretty high heating bills and energy prices too, because they're shutting down a lot of the oil and gas investments they were doing. And now you've got Germany saying, oops, maybe we don't want to shut down the nuclear power plants that we were planning on doing. Maybe the best thing to be green is to actually build more nuclear power plants. I think that would be a really, really good change.
Yeah, I've kind of, we love our analogies here. I've taken to calling it like Jules Verne. He got an astonishing amount of things right on Journey to the Moon. That, 3 guys on a couch. We put 3 guys on a couch in a capsule. He used a projectile. It was a capsule. They had to he got a lot of stuff really right. The problem was we needed to wait 84 years to NASA to figure out the really important stuff, like, hey, let's not use a cannon. Let's build a Saturn V and get it up in the low Earth orbit. I think that's where we're at with some of the energy stuff right now, where we can see the solution. We've figured out kind of the big picture part. Okay, this is possible, and here's how we do it. But there's a whole lot of people that are still in the science fiction realm of, we'll just put them in a cannon and shoot them up there. And that's how they're kind of dealing with this energy crisis stuff. That's not how the world works. We can see it, but we're still 40, 50, 60 years, whatever, maybe sooner with technology, from really changing how energy, especially geopolitical energy, and how practical energy for the poorer folks in the world are. Am I wrong in using that kind of analogy of like people can see it, and then things like Putin kind of bring it back and focus like, okay, we're not as close as we are?
I think Putin's action might have accelerated that timeline a little bit for the Western world. Now, yeah, I think you're right. And when we just talked about substituting, coal power plants for instead of and use nuclear power plants instead, right? And seeing maybe there'll be a lack of environmental activism against nuclear power plants now going forward, particularly in Europe. Although nuclear power has been pretty stalled here in the U.S. as well, which is unfortunate. As an aside, right, I used to work for a power company, so I like to think I know 1 or 2 things about power generation. So I'm going to bring some of that knowledge here. Even if we today could build, 100 nuclear power plants, and we actually had a site to put them, the distribution of that power is yet another complication. And our energy grid still desperately needs repairs. It needs upgrading. You would need a lot of more additional substations. You need some, substation infrastructure upgrades. I don't know what you do about the Texas power grid. That thing's a mess. So just think about all those moving parts. We are still a long ways away from being able to move our economy off of oil and coal.
Welcome back to Heard Tell Twice on Sunday. Thrilled that you're with us. Thank you for sticking with us all week long and for this recap that we've been doing on Sundays. Y'all asked for it. You wanted more of this. We did it. As long as you want to listen and watch it, we're happy to do it for you. On Friday, we had on Regan Farrell. This is a tough topic, but we don't dodge tough topics here. We talked about sex workers, human trafficking, regulation, decriminalizing and legalization of sex work, things like this. Now, why do we talk about that? Well, here's why. Because when you're talking about things like criminal justice reform and government accountability and policy and things that really, really matter, there's always bleeding edges of that where things get really, really messy. It's especially true when you're dealing with things like sex work and human trafficking. It gets messy in a hurry. The mess is because of a couple reasons. One is there's a tendency in law enforcement to start pushing the boundaries on what are and are not rights. And if a right is not a right for everybody, it's not a right anymore. So just because you slap something like sex works on something doesn't mean those people don't have rights. It's very important to discuss it. Also, human trafficking gets a whole lot of play, but too often in the headlines, what is claimed to be human trafficking turns out to not be that. Why is that? And we've got the data to prove it. Law enforcement and police organizations love to throw out the big terms like that, but then the crimes don't seem to match the evidence. And it turns out it's a really good way to get attention. It's a good way to get a whole lot of money and funding. We need to unpack all these things because it goes to how we police ourselves, how the police police us, how we have relationships with our government, and how bad policy usually starts by not treating people like they're human beings and not just facts, figures, and ways to get more money and or get on your moral high ground and yell at folks. It's a tough topic. It's an in-depth topic. Regan Farrell did a wonderful job breaking down through all of it. Things like the Super Bowl conspiracy theories every year, how there's going to be massive human trafficking around the Super Bowl. She's got the data and stats to figure it all out. Tough topic, but that's what we do on Heard Tell. We turn down the noise on it and we get to the facts at hand. Regan Farrell, right now on Heard Tell. All right, I'm just going to throw you the question before we dig into the issue, the pushback. Well, it is illegal, so why do I care?
It is illegal, but I try to begin with a harm reduction framework. If your main issue is helping victims, of helping people get out of something that you feel is immoral or is threatening them, then I completely understand. But the best way to do so is decriminalizing sex work. Then you're not bothering anyone who, out of their own volition, has engaged in this or needs to engage in this work in order to provide for their family. Sex work is often referred to as a victimless crime. It's not so dissimilar to other things that are completely legal, such as selling your plasma. We can have a longer debate about the ethics of work and labor if we want to, but that's not for today. But a lot of people will take jobs that they don't either care about or are actively destructive to them. I think of my father working in factories his entire life, who is not able to stand up straight anymore. And so when you're talking about sex, it's often because people feel some sort of way about the morality, and that's why it's criminalized.
Yeah. Now let's get some nomenclature done. There is a difference between decriminalizing it and making it completely legal. There's a little bit of a nuance there, just so everybody has the nomenclature right. What's the difference between legalizing it and decriminalizing it? This is language we hear with marijuana a lot of the times. We've seen it with gambling now, where gambling has gone mainstream. Just give folks the nuance of that a little bit of what exactly we're talking about here, because it comes off like we're going to have societal approval of something, and that's not exactly what we're talking about here.
It's not tacit approval. Decriminalizing sex work is preferred by sex workers because it doesn't hold a criminal penalty. Legalization often looks like what's available in Reno, Nevada, for example, which is just a state-owned monopoly. It imposes harsh regulations. Sex workers there are only able to work in the state-owned brothels. They're not allowed to work as independent contractors. And they actually turn over about 50% of their wages to the pimps, the brothel owners, in that system. Decriminalization allows sex workers to operate as independent contractors, form their own coalitions, really work out what they want to and make their own hours.
Now, over in Europe, because I lived in Germany 2 different times, over in Europe, other parts of the world, this is already kind of the standard, and yet somehow their societies have not completely collapsed into burning piles of nothingness. I'm being a little facetious because, again, I understand this is icky to people. I understand a lot of people have a moral problem with it, but they call this the world's oldest profession for a reason. Human nature is undefeated. Some of this is us beating our heads against the wall against something that's going on, and we just don't seem to want to have a realistic conversation about it, do we?
No, not at all. This is going to continue happening. You're not going to see the oldest profession immediately cave in the moment that you have criminalized it. You haven't. It still continues in the shadows, and it's just really dangerous for the people involved.
So this goes back to what we were talking about, harm reduction. You're not going to take somebody that's working on the street or out of a hotel room or whatever stereotype you have in your head about sex work. You're not going to take them from 0 to getting a college education and a middle-class job. That doesn't go from 0 to 60. So like we've seen, again, I hate to use the examples, but people understand things with legalizing drugs and drug reduction and drug harm reduction. Gambling's another example. If we're going to have good policy in these fields, even if you're dead set against them, there's a reality here of, hey, these people can't go from 0 to 60 to doing it to dead stop. You've got to have some middle grounds and some steps involved, don't you?
Entirely. Often human trafficking victims' first experience with the police is in handcuffs, not as they're being helped. And it's incredibly difficult for a lot of these human trafficking victims, once it's discovered that they're victims, to overturn their convictions. And you can imagine a world where sex work is decriminalized and there's no record. And so this person is found out to be a victim. They receive resources, help, job training, and they're not spending all of their hard-earned cash trying to overturn a conviction that is wrongly imposed upon them.
We've seen it in other areas of the criminal justice system, especially on what we call the low end, which we probably shouldn't refer to at that end, but the petty crime end, things like this. This is really a situation, again, like drug use, like recreational drug use. We seem to be making more criminals than we actually seem to be doing anything about actual crime, don't we?
We certainly do. You're hearing pushes for something called the end demand model, which sex workers advocate against. This criminalizes the client, but not the worker. In practice, this happens in Amsterdam, for example. In practice, this actually just drives the transaction further underground because sex workers will work to protect their money, their transaction, and their client. You have a very traditional sort of leaning in the window, saying hello, offering the prices. This can't happen under the end demand model because you have to speed up the entire transaction. The client is often anxious of getting arrested. And so instead, the worker will just hop in the car and then they have to negotiate once they're already in the car. They can't assess the situation before they're engaging.
That'll do it for this edition of Heard Tell Twice on Sunday. Be back with weekly episodes every weekday morning. Heard Tell. If you're subscribed on the YouTube channel, if you are subscribed on any of the podcasting platforms, you'll automatically get it every morning. Brand new episode of Heard Tell each weekday. Every afternoon, the Heard Tell Good Talks portion. That's just the interviews. We break those out. They come out every afternoon. Folks really love to respond to those. That's a great thing to share on your social media too, especially because these things are always timely. When the topics at hand come up, you can go back, pull them up, send them out again. And a lot of our guests come back and forth over and over again. So if you're subscribed, you can go through the archive, see their previous appearances on Heard Tell. Also, our partnership with Big Talker Radio. Thrilled to be working with them as always. They've been revamping. The new Facebook page is up. Looks fantastic. They stream Heard Tell every weekday, 6 a.m. with a replay at 3 p.m. They also stream the Twice on Sunday program we're doing right now. You can go on there. If you're a Facebook user, they have all the video from all the episodes that we've done since partnering with them on their Facebook page, Big Talker Network. Just put that in the search block, come right up for you. You can go to the video page, catch past episodes, and watch the live streams when they come up. Appreciate them. Now, we get back to business. We have more Heard Tell coming up this week, continuing to turn down the noise of the news cycle. We bring on great guests that are knowledgeable. Some of them will push and challenge your thinking a little bit. Some of them you won't agree with. We have on all kinds. We have conservatives on. We have libertarians on. We have progressives on. We push it because that's how you do grown folk adulting culture and politics. You got to work at it. And we'll continue to work hard as long as you want to listen and watch it. So wherever you and yours are, across the street or around the world, we appreciate you always joining us for Heard Tell. We hope you're well. We hope you're well fed. We'll talk to you soon on Heard Tell. All the music on Heard Tell is provided under a Creative Content license from monstercat.com.
Somos la máquina.